Welcome to our deep dive into the Bible. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, the impact this book has had. I mean, on history, on culture, on everything, really.
I know that's mind-boggling.
It is. So we're going to be using the NIV 1984 version for this deep dive, and I know we can't cover everything,
No, not even close.
but we are going to highlight some of the most fascinating, the parts that really make you think, kind of give you a taste of the stories, the people, and the big ideas that make the Bible so powerful.
And even just picking a version is interesting, right? Because there are so many different ways to translate and interpret it.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe we could do a whole deep dive on that another time. But for today, let's just start at the very beginning.
Okay, so Genesis.
Genesis. Light, darkness, and boom, the universe is born.
Right out of the gate, it's huge.
Then we meet Adam and Eve hanging out in the Garden of Eden. Seems pretty idyllic until that serpent shows up. What's your take on the serpent, not just as a tempter, but also in terms of bringing knowledge and choice into the picture?
Well, it's interesting how the serpent's questions, kind of tricky questions, but they lead Adam and Eve to a whole new level of awareness. They suddenly realize they're naked and they become aware of good and evil. So it makes you wonder, was this knowledge ultimately a blessing or a curse?
Oh, for sure. It really complicates things. And the consequences for Adam and Eve are, well, they're pretty huge. But there's something that always strikes me, those incredibly long lifespans. I mean, Adam lives for 930 years and his son Seth, 912 years. What do you make of that? Do you see them as symbolic or maybe reflecting a different understanding of time, back then?
Yeah, that's a question that's puzzled scholars for centuries. Some people see them as symbolic, like you said, representing a different relationship with time and with death, too, maybe. Others think maybe they measured time differently back then or recorded it in a way we don't understand. What are your thoughts?
I'm kind of leaning towards the symbolic interpretation. It just adds another layer to the story,
Yeah.
And speaking of big events, we can't forget about Noah and the flood, a story of obedience, destruction, and ultimately renewal. What stands out to you about that story?
Well, I think it's a really powerful story, one that speaks to this idea of cycles, of creation and destruction. It's a theme that we see throughout history, across different cultures even. The flood wipes away the old world and makes space for a new beginning. It's a reminder that even when things seem completely destroyed, there's always that possibility of hope, of renewal.
I like that. I like that perspective a lot. And after the flood, we see the scattering of the Canaanite clans, and they end up settling in all these different territories, which kind of sets the stage for a lot of what happens next. But let's shift our focus to Abraham now. He's a central figure in the Bible. His covenant with God is kind of like the foundation of faith for so many people. What do you think about the significance of the covenant?
Well, the covenant with Abraham, it's more than just an agreement, right? It's a promise. It's a bond between God and his people. And circumcision, the sign of the covenant, that's not just some random physical act. It represents a commitment, like an outward sign of an inward change.
And then there's that story, that really challenging story, of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. What are your thoughts on that one? It raises some pretty big questions about faith and obedience and what God expects from us.
Yeah, the story of Abraham and Isaac, it's one that people are still talking about, still debating even. Is it a test of faith? Is it about showing complete obedience? Or is it, a disturbing example of blind loyalty? It's a story that doesn't give us easy answers, and maybe that's why it keeps fascinating us, challenging us.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy story to wrap your head around. Thankfully, Isaac doesn't actually get sacrificed in the end. And he goes on to marry Rebekah, and there's this interesting detail about her covering herself with a veil when she first sees Isaac. Why do you think that detail was included?
Well, it could just be, reflecting the customs back then. But maybe it symbolizes modesty or respect or even like recognizing how sacred that encounter was. It's just a small detail, but it adds something, some depth to their story.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about all those cultural nuances that are embedded in these stories. One more thing about both Abraham and Isaac, famine seems to pop up a lot in their lives, and it forces them to make some tough choices. What do you think the significance of that recurring famine is?
Famine in the Bible, it's often more than just a physical hardship. It can be a symbol for spiritual emptiness, for a lack of faith, or a time of testing, of being refined. It forces them to face their deepest fears and rely on God to provide.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got Abraham, then Isaac, and now we come to Jacob. His life is, full of twists and turns, starting with his complicated relationship with his brother Esau. What do you make of Jacob, especially when you consider how he tricked his father to get his blessing?
Jacob is, he's a complicated guy. He's ambitious, he's clever, and sometimes even deceitful. But he's also someone who, he wrestles with God, he seeks blessings, and he struggles with his flaws. His story reminds us that even the people God chooses can be deeply flawed, and their journeys are rarely straightforward.
He's definitely a schemer, that's for sure. He also goes through a lot, 2 marriages to Leah and Rachel, and he clearly favors Rachel, which of course causes heartache for Leah. The dynamics between those two sisters are so fascinating. What themes do you see in their story?
I think their story really highlights rivalry and favoritism and this deep desire for love and acceptance. It also makes you think about the norms of that society, especially around marriage and the status of women. It's a reminder that even in these ancient stories, we find echoes of experiences and emotions that are so human, so relatable.
Definitely. And despite all his scheming early on, Jacob ends up becoming quite prosperous. But when he returns to his homeland, it's not easy. Remember how afraid he was when he found out Esau was coming? What do you think that fear represents?
It's like the weight of his past actions catching up with him, the realization that no matter how hard you try to move forward, the choices you made can still have a huge impact. It's a reminder that reconciliation is important and that we have to face the consequences of our actions.
So true. And let's not forget, Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph and Benjamin, the sons of his beloved Rachel, they become super important later on. But before we get to them, there's this story that always makes people raise their eyebrows, Judah and Tamar. What makes the story so compelling? And what does it tell us about the society they lived in?
The story of Judah and Tamar is, it's one of the most complex and challenging stories in the whole Bible. It touches on deception, societal norms, justice, and even redemption. Tamar, she's widowed twice, and then she's denied the right to marry someone from Judah's family, so she takes things into her own hands. She disguises herself and tricks Judah into sleeping with her, and she ends up pregnant with twins.
Talk about a power move. She uses Judah's own seal, cord, and staff to prove he's responsible. And then there's the part with the midwife marking the firstborn twin with a scarlet thread. What's the significance of that? How will people interpret it over the years?
The scarlet thread, it's a powerful symbol, and it's been interpreted in so many ways. Some people see it as a symbol of redemption, like connected to the bloodline of the Messiah. Others see it as a reminder that life is fragile and that it's important to mark those significant moments. It's one of those details that people are still thinking about, still trying to figure out.
It's amazing how a seemingly small detail can have such a lasting impact. Speaking of impact, we can't leave out the story of Joseph and his brothers. It's one of the most famous stories in the Bible, and for good reason. Jealousy, betrayal, dreams, slavery, forgiveness. It's got it all. What makes this story so enduring, so universal?
Well, the story of Joseph and his brothers is like this timeless story about human relationships. It explores envy, betrayal, forgiveness, reconciliation, all those big themes. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for things to get better, for hope to emerge. And it also speaks to the idea that God can work through even the most difficult situations to achieve his purpose.
It's the classic underdog story too, right? Joseph goes from being a slave to a powerful figure in Egypt. And his ability to interpret dreams, it starts with the cupbearer and the baker, but it foreshadows his role in saving Egypt from famine. And then, when his brothers come to Egypt looking for food, it all comes full circle. What do you make of that moment when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers?
It's a powerful moment, right? There's recognition, reconciliation, and forgiveness. Joseph's brothers, who betrayed him, they're totally at his mercy. But instead of revenge, he offers compassion, a chance to start over. It's a reminder that even the deepest wounds can be healed through forgiveness and grace.
That's a message we need to hear now more than ever. And before we move on from Joseph, we need to talk about another major figure, Moses. He's born during a time when the Israelites are really suffering, enslaved in Egypt. But he's raised in Pharaoh's court. What do you think about that, how his upbringing shaped his destiny?
Yeah, his upbringing is fascinating. Growing up in Pharaoh's court gave him a really unique perspective. He saw the power and cruelty of the Egyptian empire, but he also carried the heritage and the suffering of his own people. He was caught between two worlds, which kind of prepared him to be a mediator, a bridge between the Israelites and Pharaoh.
And then there's that moment, that iconic moment with the burning bush. What do you make of that scene, and what does it tell us about how God reveals himself, how he communicates with us?
The burning bush is this powerful symbol of God's presence, like this manifestation of the divine in the everyday world. It reminds us that God can speak to us in unexpected ways through seemingly ordinary moments and encounters.
It gives a whole new meaning to stop and smell the roses, right? And then God identifies himself to Moses as, I am the Lord. What's the significance of that name, and how does it change how the Israelites see their relationship with God?
You know, the name I am the Lord is so much more than just a name. It's a declaration of God's existence, his power, his faithfulness. It's a name that evokes awe and intimacy, suggesting a God who is beyond our understanding, but also present with us, powerful, but also compassionate.
It's definitely a name with a lot of weight behind it. And then you have the plagues, locusts, darkness, the death of the firstborn, all culminating in that incredible escape during Passover. What are your thoughts on the plagues? How do they fit into the larger story of the Exodus?
The plagues are often seen as this demonstration of God's power over the Egyptian gods, this huge battle between good and evil. They also show how Pharaoh becomes more and more desperate and how his heart hardens, even as he's faced with all this evidence.
Talk about a showdown. And even after all that, the Israelites still find things to complain about in the desert. Can you believe it? What does that tell us about human nature? About how we can doubt even when we've seen miracles?
It's so human, isn't it? Their complaining shows how we tend to doubt, how we focus on the negative even when we're surrounded by good things. It's a reminder that faith isn't always easy, that even people who have seen miracles can struggle with trust and gratitude.
I guess even manna and quail get old after a while, huh?
Hmm.
But the Sabbath, that day of rest, now that's something I can get behind. It's an idea that's had such a profound impact on our lives. What do you think the Sabbath represents, and why do you think it's lasted so long?
You know, the Sabbath is more than just a day off. It's a time for reflection, for connecting with God, for remembering creation and our place in it. It's a practice that challenges us to slow down in our busy world, reminding us that rest and renewal are important.
It's a good reminder to slow down and appreciate the moment, that's for sure. But let's get back to Moses. He leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai, and that's where God gives him the Ten Commandments. Those rules have had a monumental impact on Western civilization, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The Ten Commandments are more than just rules. They're like this framework for ethical living, for building societies that are just and compassionate. They address these fundamental questions about human relationships, about our responsibilities to God and to each other.
And it's not just the Ten Commandments. The book of Exodus lays out a whole legal system covering everything from personal injury to lending practices to blasphemy. What do all these laws tell us about the values and beliefs of the Israelites?
I think these laws show a deep concern for justice, for protecting those who are vulnerable, for establishing a society that honors God and reflects his character. They also reveal a complex understanding of purity and holiness and the boundaries between what's sacred and what's not.
And that idea of holiness keeps coming up, right? Obedience to God's commands is so important. Speaking of holiness, we have to talk about the tabernacle. It's God's dwelling place among the people. What's your take on the significance of the tabernacle, both as a physical structure and as a symbol?
Well, the tabernacle is a powerful symbol of God's presence among his people. And the way it's constructed is described in such detail, every little thing. It emphasizes how important it was to create a sacred space, a place set apart for worship and for encountering the divine.
And then you have the appointment of Aaron and his sons as priests. They're anointed with holy oil. And anyone else who approaches the sanctuary faces serious consequences. What are your thoughts on the role of the priesthood? What does it tell us about how the Israelites understood the relationship between humanity and the divine?
The priesthood is a vital part of how the Israelites worshipped. The priests were like mediators between God and the people. They offered sacrifices, led the rituals, and interceded for the community. It was a role that demanded holiness and humility, recognizing the awesome power of God and the need to follow his commands carefully.
And of course, we can't forget about the golden calf. Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the law, and while he's gone, well, the Israelites kind of lose it. They build this idol and start worshiping it. What do you make of that incident, and what does it say about our tendency to stray from God's path, even after we've experienced his power firsthand?
It's like this stark reminder that we're human, that we're fallible. The golden calf incident shows this persistent pull we have toward idolatry, toward creating something we can see and touch to worship, even when it goes against our own beliefs. It's like they needed to see God to believe in him.
It's a sobering thought that even those who have witnessed God's power can still fall into doubt and fear. But even after that rebellion, Moses pleads for the people, and they're forgiven. and then begins their long and difficult journey to the Promised Land. What does that journey represent, and what challenges do they encounter along the way?
The journey to the promised land, it's not just about physically traveling, right? It represents this spiritual journey, this process of change and growth. The Israelites are tested along the way. They complain, they doubt, but God stays faithful, providing for them and guiding them towards the land he promised. It's a journey that reflects the challenges and the victories of faith, the ongoing struggle to trust God, even when the way ahead is uncertain.
And that's a journey that so many of us can relate to, even today.
It's a reminder that having faith isn't always easy, but even when we feel lost, God is with us, guiding us. Picking up where we left off, the Israelites are, well, they're right there on the edge of the promised land. It's a big shift, going from, slavery to freedom, from depending on others to this new responsibility.
And with that responsibility, like you might expect, comes a whole bunch of rules and guidelines, kind of like a divine blueprint well, for building a just and thriving society.
Yeah.
But it's not just about external rules, right? There's also this focus on internal transformation, on becoming a holy people.
Exactly. Holiness in this context, it's not just about like ritual purity. It's about reflecting God's character in everything they do, their relationships, their justice system, even their economic practices. It's like this holistic vision.
It definitely goes beyond just like checking off boxes.
Yeah.
What are some of the laws that really show this vision of a just and compassionate society?
Well, you see a whole range of regulations. Some deal with personal injury, like the eye for an eye principle. Others focus on fairness in lending practices, property rights, and how they treat the poor and vulnerable. It's really interesting to see how these laws try to create a safety net, a system where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
And it's remarkable how many of these ideas still resonate with us today. They're woven into our own laws and our social values. But speaking of remembering their roots, didn't the Israelites kind of mess up with that whole golden calf thing? Even with God guiding them, they still, human nature kind of took over, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The golden calf incident is a perfect example of how, even with clear rules and God's guidance, it's still so easy to stray from the path. They wanted something they could see and touch, something that made sense to them instead of trusting in the unseen. What do you think about that human need to have something tangible to represent God?
It's fascinating, isn't it? It makes you wonder about the role of symbols and rituals in our own lives, how we try to make sense of things that are abstract and, well, intangible. But back to their journey, they do eventually reach the Promised Land. So what happens next? Is it smooth sailing from there?
Reaching the promised land is one thing, but conquering it and settling it, well, that's a whole other story. The book of Joshua tells the story of their battles and victories as they take possession of the land. And it's a long and sometimes pretty violent process. What are your thoughts on this whole period of conquest and settlement?
It feels very different from the Exodus, doesn't it? They go from being liberated to conquering, from running away from oppression to engaging in conflict. It raises some tough questions about, what their mission really was and whether violence was justified. What stands out to you about this period?
Well, the fall of Jericho is a classic, The marching, the trumpets, the walls collapsing. It's a powerful image of God intervening. And then there's the story of Rahab, the Canaanite woman who helps the Israelite spies. She's spared when the city is destroyed, which shows how her faith and courage were rewarded.
It reminds us that God's grace can reach beyond his chosen people, to those who show trust and loyalty. So they conquer the land, but is it happily ever after from there? Do they manage to create a stable and righteous society?
Not exactly. The book of Judges shows us a pretty turbulent time, a cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. The Israelites stray from God, they face the consequences, they cry out for help, and then God sends judges to rescue them. It's a reminder that building a just and faithful society is, it's an ongoing struggle full of challenges and setbacks.
It sounds like a time of constant struggle, both from within and from outside forces. Who are some of the key figures and events that stand out to you from this time?
Oh, there are some definitely memorable judges. You've got Gideon, who defeats the Midianites with a surprisingly small army, relying more on faith and strategy than just brute force. Then there's Samson, with his superhuman strength and his weakness for women. He's a fascinating character, that's for sure. And Deborah, she's a prophetess who leads Israel to victory, which challenges, those traditional ideas about gender roles and leadership.
Samson definitely sounds like the most entertaining, although his story also has some warnings in it. But it seems like these judges are mainly Military leaders, not really lawgivers or spiritual guides.
That's true. Their main focus is rescuing the people from their enemies. But their stories show how important courage is and faith and relying on God's strength, especially when you're up against impossible odds. It's interesting because even in this chaotic time, there are still those moments of hope and inspiration.
So how does this period of Judges transition into something more stable? Do they ever manage to establish a unified and lasting kingdom?
Well, that leads us to a turning point, the shift from judges to kings. The Israelites are tired of all the chaos, so they want a king to rule over them, just like the other nations around them. What do you think about this change in leadership? Does it fit with their covenant with God?
It seems natural to want stability in a leader you can see, but it also feels like they're moving away from the idea of God being their true king. It makes you wonder about the tension between our human desires for power and God's plan for us.
It's definitely a complex issue. Samuel, the last judge, warns the people about the dangers of having a human king, but in the end, he anoints Saul as the first king of Israel. And Saul's reign is, well, it's a fascinating study in leadership, both the good and the bad. What's your take on Saul?
He starts out strong, winning battles and all that, but then pride and disobedience lead to his downfall. It's that classic story, right? The one that reminds us that even those chosen to lead can be brought down by their own weaknesses. So what happens after Saul's reign falls apart?
That brings us to one of the most famous figures in the Bible, David. The shepherd boy who kills Goliath, the giant. A story that's all about courage and overcoming obstacles. He's a complex character, wouldn't you say?
Oh, David is definitely larger than life. A warrior, a poet, a musician, and like you said, someone who makes mistakes. But he's remembered as, a man after God's own heart. What qualities do you think earned him that title?
David's reign is like this golden age for Israel. He unites the tribes, makes Jerusalem the capital, and expands the kingdom's borders. But beyond his achievements in battle and politics, he's also known for writing many of the Psalms, which still offer comfort and inspiration to people all over the world.
The Psalms are so powerful, so raw and emotional, and so deeply spiritual. It's amazing how they can still speak to people today. But even David, with all his success and his spirituality, he still faces challenges, makes mistakes. What are some of those darker moments in his life, and how do they affect the way we see him?
His story is full of drama. Family feuds, political conspiracies, even a rebellion led by his own son, Absalom. It reminds us that even the greatest people are still human, capable of doing great things, but also making big mistakes. It makes him more human, more relatable.
It's a good reminder that we all have our ups and downs, even those in positions of power. Despite his flaws, David is remembered as a great king. And it's through his family line that the Messiah is promised, a descendant of David who will establish a kingdom of peace and righteousness that will last forever. What are your thoughts on this messianic prophecy? How does it shape the Israelites' hopes for the future?
It's like this beacon of hope, a promise that a future king will come who embodies justice and righteousness, and in the end, God's will on earth. It becomes a central theme in Jewish thought and anticipation.
So David's reign eventually comes to an end.
Mm-hmm.
Who takes over? One of his many sons, I'm guessing.
Yes. Solomon, known for his wisdom, takes over after his father. He builds that magnificent temple in Jerusalem, expands trade, and brings in a period of peace and prosperity. It's a good time for Israel. What are your thoughts on Solomon's reign, especially compared to his father's?
It sounds like he had a pretty good run. Wisdom, wealth, peace. But there are hints of trouble, right? What eventually leads to the end of this golden age?
Well, despite his wisdom and success early on, Solomon's wealth and his many wives lead him astray. He builds temples for foreign gods, and after he dies, the kingdom is divided. It's a classic example of how power and prosperity, when they're not based on faith and humility, can lead to corruption and decline.
It's a lesson that's relevant no matter what time period you're in. So the kingdom splits. What happens to the Israelites after that? How do their paths diverge? And what are some of the key events and people that shape their destinies?
The northern kingdom, Israel, they struggle with idolatry and instability, going through a whole bunch of kings, many of whom are portrayed as wicked and unjust. The southern kingdom, Judah, they're not perfect either, but they generally stay more faithful to God. What interests you about this period of the divided kingdom?
It's fascinating to see how their paths split, how the choices they make and their leaders affect the fate of each kingdom. It feels kind of inevitable, doesn't it? Their choices seem to lead them further and further away from that vision of a united and righteous nation. What are some of the most important figures and events from this era?
Well, in the north, you've got the prophet Elijah. He's this fiery figure who confronts the wicked king Ahab and his wife Jezebel about their worship of Baal. His story is full of dramatic showdowns, miracles, and even a fiery chariot ride into heaven. It's quite a story.
Elijah sounds like a force to be reckoned with. What about in Judah? What are some of the key moments in their story?
There are some good kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah. They lead religious reforms, tearing down idols, repairing the temple, and calling the people back to their covenant with God. It's a hopeful contrast to what's happening in the north.
It's good to see those signs of revival and reform. But if I remember correctly, despite those efforts, things don't end well for either kingdom. What causes their downfall and what happens to the Israelites?
You're right, unfortunately. Even with those moments of repentance and renewal, both kingdoms eventually fall. Israel to the Assyrians and Judah to the Babylonians. It's a devastating time, and the exile is a dark chapter in their history. How do you imagine this period felt for them?
It's just heartbreaking to think about them being forced out of their homeland, their temple destroyed, their whole way of life disrupted. It's a profound loss, a collective trauma that would affect generations to come. What happens to them during this time of exile? How do they keep their faith and their identity when everything familiar is gone?
It really is hard to grasp, the sheer depth of loss and despair they must have felt. Uprooted, their temple in ruins, their whole way of life shattered. It's a monumental shift. How do they even begin to process that? And can they hold on to hope in the midst of all that devastation?
It's a period of, well, immense suffering and soul-searching for sure. Everything they knew is gone, and they're forced to really confront their faith, their understanding of God's presence. But even in all that darkness, there are these flickers of hope. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they step up, offering comfort and the promise of eventually returning home.
Exactly. And it's incredible, isn't it, how resilience and faith can blossom, even when things are so bleak. Those prophets, their voices must have been like a lifeline for the Israelites in exile. What were some of their main messages, the promises they gave during that time?
Well, they stressed that God hadn't abandoned them, that their exile wasn't like a final punishment, but more of a refining process, a time to look inward, to return to the covenant. They talk about a future restoration, a return to their homeland, rebuilding their lives. It's a message that sustains them through those long years of captivity.
A message that has resonated throughout history, offering hope to anyone facing their own dark times, their own displacement. It speaks to the power of faith, that belief in a future restoration. So how does this return actually happen? Do they just wake up one morning back in Jerusalem?
Not quite. It's a gradual thing. It unfolds over time. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they tell the story of this period, the journey back, rebuilding the temple, restoring the city walls, reestablishing their religious and social structures. It's a huge undertaking.
I bet it was a mix of emotions, right? Excitement about going home, but also apprehension about starting over after losing so much. It's one thing to dream about going back, but to actually face the reality of rebuilding, that's tough. What obstacles do they run into during this rebuilding process?
Well, there are challenges from outside. Opposition from neighboring groups who aren't happy about their return, who try to undermine their efforts. And then there are internal disputes, disagreements about how to interpret the law, how to rebuild the temple, how to even define themselves as a nation. It's a time of intense debate and negotiation.
Sounds like a microcosm of what any community faces when they're trying to rebuild after going through something so traumatic. You've got that external pressure and then the internal struggle to figure out who they are, what their purpose is. It's fascinating to see how those tensions play out. So as they rebuild their society, bring back their religious practices, do they find unity? Do they manage to overcome the divisions that caused their downfall in the first place?
Not completely. As we get further into the Old Testament, we see different groups emerging within Judaism. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, each with their own interpretations of the law, their own traditions. It shows the diversity within their faith, but it also leads to arguments and disagreements about the right way to live out their covenant with God.
So even within their own faith, there's this spectrum of beliefs and practices. It shows us that interpreting Scripture, figuring out how to live out your faith, it's an ongoing conversation, a process that keeps evolving. Does this diversity lead to conflict or cooperation? How do these groups interact with each other?
It's a bit of both, really. They debate, they argue about religious practices, and sometimes they challenge each other's authority, but they also recognize their shared history, their commitment to the covenant. It's complicated, and it's something that continues to shape Jewish thought and practice today.
Right. It reminds us that religious traditions aren't static. that they change and adapt as new generations come along, wrestling with those ancient texts, applying them to their own lives and circumstances. It's living conversation. So, as we come to the end of the Old Testament, what's the overall feeling? What's the sense of where things are heading?
There's a definite sense of anticipation, a sense of waiting. The prophets have spoken of a coming Messiah, a king who will restore David's throne, usher in a new age of peace and righteousness. They're waiting, longing for the fulfillment of those ancient promises.
Feels like the stage is set for something big to happen, a new chapter in their story. And that, of course, leads us to the New Testament. Would you say that the Old Testament lays the groundwork for the coming of Jesus, for the emergence of Christianity?
Absolutely. The New Testament doesn't come out of nowhere. It builds on the foundation of the Old Testament, taking those themes, characters, prophecies, and reinterpreting them, expanding on them in profound ways.
It's like a sequel that adds another layer to the original story, The arrival of Jesus, it's presented as the fulfillment of those messianic prophecies, the one who brings God's kingdom to earth, but in a way that no one expected.
And that's where we have to leave our deep dive for today. We've gone from the creation of the world to the fall of kingdoms, from exile to the promise of a new covenant. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And it's amazing how these ancient stories still speak to us today, offering insights into what it means to be human, the nature of faith, and our search for meaning and purpose. What are some of the things you hope our listeners will think about as we wrap up?
I hope they can appreciate the sheer scope of the Bible. The different voices, the different genres, the perspectives it contains. It's not just one single message. It's this rich tapestry of stories, poems, laws, prophecies, historical accounts, all offering their own unique take on the relationship between humanity and the divine.
It's like a whole library in one book, inviting us to explore, discover the parts that speak to us. It's not about blindly accepting things. It's about engaging with it, asking questions, searching, finding meaning that connects to our own lives.
Exactly. And in the end, I hope our listeners will be inspired to keep exploring, keep digging into the Bible, and find their own connection to this incredible text that has influenced civilizations for thousands of years.
And who knows what you might find.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this thought. Which story, which character resonated with you the most? What passage sparked your curiosity, made you question what you thought you knew? The conversation never really ends. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and discover the richness and depth of the Bible for yourselves. Thanks for joining us on this adventure. It's been a pleasure to share this journey with you.